Charles Henry Bukowski was one of literature's most polarizing yet important literary figures of the modern era. You either love Bukowski or you hate Bukowski. It's very rare to meet somebody that's kind of in between. I'll say that I'm a rather strong Bukowski fan. Having said that, I see the flaws in his writing. I realize he's not the most important writer. He was definitely not. But there is a realness, there is a directness to his writing and sort of a rawness that not only me but millions of others appreciate. So please join us in today's video for the life and legacy and myth surrounding the legend of Charles Henry Bukowski. Please hit that like button, share this video, and please check out all the literary playlists and book haul playlists and various other topics that we have listed down in the description below for you all. Make sure you guys share this video with all your bookish literary friends and join me for the strange world of Charles Bukowski. The world of Charles Bukowski is one of both controversy, rumor, speculation, and potential myth. It is important to keep in mind that Bukowski was a legend of his own making, and many unanswered questions remain about the validity of his claims regarding his alter ego, Henry Chinaski. Moreover, in the Bukowski universe, there seem to be almost two different Bukowskis, the one of reality that existed and the one that existed only in his writing. And I think that's an important topic to sort of bring up when we're discussing Charles Bukowski. How much of the Henry Chinaski alter ego or legacy or legend is actually real? Is there two separate Bukowskis? Was Henry Chinaski just an extension of everything that the real Charles Bukowski, all the real activities and turmoils of the real Charles Bukowski? I tend to believe that the truth merges somewhere in the middle, and what we have after that is sort of the leftover real Charles Bukowski or lack of real Charles Bukowski. Now, in terms of his literary merit, Charles Bukowski came around at a time when I think Americans, readers in general, were really thirsty, were really hungry for something more direct, more down to earth, more gritty, more realistic. We had just come off the cusp of people like, Jack Kerouac with On the Road and Henry Miller and various other writers from the early 1900s. But the whole Beat generation, sort of the writing was a little bit fluffed up. You don't really have to sit there and try to figure out what he's philosophizing about. And in the legacy of Charles Bukowski's work and writing, obviously we have two separate parts, or maybe even three separate parts. We have the early short stories, and then we have the poetry career that sort of existed, begun in the 1960s and ran throughout Bukowski's life. And obviously in the early 1970s, Bukowski began to publish novels as well. We have a lot of material. I'm obviously not going to be able to cover every single Bukowski genre in this video, but I did want to sort of touch upon the fact that there is a whole plethora, a whole myriad, if you will, of different types of Bukowski. So if you don't like his poetry, maybe you'll like some of his short story essays. If you don't like his essays or his stories, maybe you'll like his novels. If you don't like his novels, maybe you'll like his poetry. Or maybe I can just inspire you to watch some of his interviews, which are very inspiring and just really hilariously fun to sort of get into, trying to get some literary inspiration or interesting life advice. Charles Bukowski was born in 1920 in Andernach, Germany, to German parents, and he emigrated to the U.S. roughly around 1923, where his father sort of sold milk, was sort of like a dairy salesman. Now, Charles Bukowski's father, Heinrich Bukowski, was a strict disciplinarian, and we cannot open up the universe of Charles Bukowski's life, legacy, or work without discussing the unfortunately very complicated relationship that Charles Bukowski had with his father, Heinrich Bukowski. Heinrich Bukowski was very, like I said, he was a disciplinarian. He abused Bukowski physically and emotionally. So obviously there was a sadistic, very depraved nature to Charles Bukowski's father. Charles Bukowski obviously holds a lot of resentment towards his father for that. There seems to be some tension there. His father looks like an ugly, mean, cruel bastard with bad breath, as Charles Bukowski describes him. So I don't want to speculate on what the extent of the abuse that Charles Bukowski suffered under Heinrich Bukowski, but it was because Charles Bukowski writes again and again in his poetry and his stories the abuse that he suffered from his father. And there was the trio of him and his parents, that being Charles Bukowski and Heinrich. Katharina Bukowski was Bukowski's mother, and she more or less stayed silent, stayed complicit in the physical / mental abuse of Charles Bukowski, and said that your father is always right, as Charles Bukowski, was quoted many times. She was just sort of like a submissive wife / mother that just let their kids be horrifically mistreated. So the extent of Heinrich Bukowski's abuse on Katharina Bukowski, maybe that was a fear of hers as well. You can't discuss, the Charles Bukowski legacy without discussing the not only the influence that the Heinrich Bukowski had on the young Charles Bukowski's psyche, but also the way that it influenced his literature. And he said that his father made him a writer because his father taught him about undeserved cruelty. I'm sort of paraphrasing there. But those young mistreatment highly influenced young Bukowski's worldview. And as a result of this prolific from Charles Bukowski's father, by the time Charles Bukowski was in high school, he began to develop terrible, crippling cystic acne that scarred up his whole face. That's why Charles Bukowski's face looks the way it does throughout his life. When you see drawings or photographs of him, he just looks like a real monster. But that was obviously not just a result of the alcohol and the tobacco and all that. It was the result of the cystic acne. If anybody's had acne, that's bad enough, but cystic acne is a whole nother set of nightmares. Charles Bukowski talks about in Ham on Rye, where he was, watching his peers and his classmates at the high school prom. I think later at graduation too, and Charles Bukowski was kind of watching from a distance of looking like a mummy because he was bandaged up. His face was in the process of being drained. They had to drain the pus-filled wounds on his face from the cystic acne, and sort of the sense that Charles Bukowski got that he was an ugly outsider and that everybody else was better than him as a result of being put down all those years from his father, sort of caused this stress in this his hormones are all messed up too because he was a teenager, but it's of his father manifested. That's what is alleged by scholars and alleged by doctors and such, that things like that can happen, whether it's migraines or acne. Or now, if you're interested in the early life of Charles Bukowski, Ham on Rye is really a great place to start. It starts when he's a child and then turns into when he's an adolescent, and then sort of his young adulthood, sort of flirting with the idea of becoming a writer. But Ham on Rye is really strictly a coming of age story, but you really get a really nice first-hand account of Charles Bukowski's home life and his social life during the time of elementary, middle, and high school, his sort of young sexual awakening or lack thereof, and sort of the sexuality of Charles Bukowski, I think, is another interesting place to sort of discuss the legacy of Charles Bukowski. But roughly around high school, maybe middle school, Charles Bukowski did start to write short stories. I think he may have gotten published in his high school paper, and he later pursued a degree at college, but he actually dropped out. He just was not interested. He actually attended LA Community College, I think for journalism or something like that. And we get a little bit of those early days at Charles Bukowski's college career in Ham on Rye. Now, jumping back to Charles Bukowski's complicated relationship with his family, we do have to discuss the one event that sort of led to Charles Bukowski's wanderlust. And yes, Charles Bukowski wandered all around the U.S., writing and drinking and carousing, and obviously he had a home base in LA. We don't really know what the extent of whether or not he was funded by his father, whether he was funded by somebody in the family, or whether he had some kind of inheritance. But sort of the Henry Chinaski legend or the Charles Bukowski myth is that he was very poor. We'll get to some of that stuff later, some of the speculations. But in terms of Charles Bukowski's young wanderlust and sort of the final straw with his father, if you will, after a night of heavy drinking, Charles Bukowski arrived home and was knocking on the door for his parents to let him in, and his mother looked through the peephole and said, "You're drunk, you're not coming in here." So Charles Bukowski, being as drunk as he was and being full of angst and anger and depression, started banging against the door, finally bashed open the door. You can watch him talk about this in the Charles Bukowski tapes. You can read about it on Ham on Rye. His father comes downstairs, and from the exertion and from the stress, Charles Bukowski just starts vomiting all over the carpet in front of his parents. I think there was a sense of shame and embarrassment there, but to add insult to injury, Charles Bukowski's father takes him by the neck or the back of the hair and puts his face down in his own vomit and says, you know, this is what we do to dogs who vomit on the carpet. And Charles Bukowski had had enough by this point and just uppercuts his father out of the blue, totally unexpected, shocking both not only his father, who plummets down the couch in total shock, but also his mother, who approaches the young Charles Bukowski and just starts raking him down the face. And Charles Bukowski says his mother just rakes him down the face and says, you hit your father, you hit your father. And just these crazy traumatic things that make people wonder how Charles Bukowski didn't end up 10 times worse than he actually already was or does later become later in his life. Brutal as that was, Heinrich Bukowski never laid another finger on the young Bukowski or the adult Bukowski or the Bukowski in general. Mistreatment that Charles Bukowski suffered from Heinrich Bukowski. So his father was a cruel, mean bastard with bad breath, as Charles Bukowski wrote many times. And like I said, I think the extent of the mistreatment of Charles Bukowski's father on his son was fairly horrific and definitely set up Bukowski for a life of not being very successful in terms of having people skills and having trust, developing relationships, so on and so forth. Now, this point in Bukowski's life, sort of this final straw, you know, assaulting his father sort of realizing that he could no longer control and mistreat Charles Henry Bukowski, and his mother's, you know, giving up on him, and he dropped out of college and he was going out drinking every night. They obviously did not see a lot of potential in their son, and this sort of begins the wanderlust. And Charles Bukowski claims that he did all this traveling to, you know, just to get as far away from his father as he possibly could. And these early days of Bukowski are documented in novels such as Factotum, obviously Ham on Rye, but mostly primarily Factotum, and Ham on Rye is really where you'll get sort of those early, really interesting detailed accounts of the complicated relationship between Charles Bukowski and his parents, but also these early jobs that he had. And going back to Charles Bukowski's sexuality, Charles Bukowski lost his virginity sort of around the time period when he was writing about in Factotum, when he was 24 years old, and he was hanging out at this dive bar, and a 300-pound plus-size prostitute sort of approached him. They started talking, and he talks about this in many interviews. He said she was drunk and I was drunk, and he claims that it was not a very good experience for him. But he says he worked and he worked and he worked and he struggled and struggled, and he thought that by the time that him and this 300-pound prostitute had, you know, made love, and he had lost his wallet, and he accuses this, you know, obese prostitute of stealing his wallet, and it turns out she didn't steal his wallet, and he felt really bad. Even Charles Bukowski's first time getting laid was horrific. Charles Bukowski did not have a lot of early good experiences in his early life. He did find love and happiness later on to a certain extent in his, obviously he found literary success, but his early life was plagued with setback after setback and failure and horrific mistreatment from various people, from his parents and his peers. And so he definitely developed this narcissistic, self-fulfilling sort of negative attitude towards life and relationships and women, and he did not have a very good outlook on life to a certain degree. But we'll get into sort of Charles Bukowski's philosophy later on in this video, and you can judge for yourself. Now, during these early days of Charles Bukowski's early drunken carousing and sort of blazing his way across the United States, he was getting lots and lots of material for his writing and his poetry and his novels and stories, and basically just going from one job to the next is what we're sort of led to believe. He was even homeless in Atlanta, living in a shack, but he was, you know, writing on a regular basis, we are led to believe. It actually ends up in Philadelphia, which he said was 10 times worse than New York City, 10, you know, tougher than New York. He said they killed on the streets and bribed the cops, and everybody was drunk and drinking and doing drugs. And he ends up at this weird, sketchy bar in the middle of the day. He sort of wrote about it in Barfly, where he talks about he found his nirvana was at this really chaotic bar in the middle of the day where they were throwing beer bottles and fighting each other. You can sort of see where this sort of the idea of the Charles Bukowski myth comes in. Some of the stories that Charles Bukowski tells, they're not so outlandish that you can't believe, but it's difficult to imagine how Charles Bukowski was able to go from so many many different places in the country without somebody perhaps funding him. Obviously things were a little cheaper back then. Maybe he would work for a couple weeks or a couple months, even just save enough just to pay rent and to buy a drink, and then maybe he would go to the next town with 10-20 bucks in his pocket and just sort of do the whole thing over and over again. That is possible. We will get into some of the other conspiracies or controversies surrounding not only who Charles Bukowski was, but who he was possibly funded or aided by in later on in this video. But I want to continue with the sort of the literary lifestyle of Bukowski first. Now, in the early 1940s, obviously war was breaking out. That was roughly around the time of World War II. And Charles Bukowski was summoned, or he was arrested actually for draft evasion and spent like 17 days in jail, and was later given what's called a 4F classification due to not believing in the war. Charles Bukowski has talked about this. It's interesting that it doesn't come up in every single biography. So did Charles Bukowski really spend 2 months in jail for draft evasion? It was so long ago, it's hard to document these things. Maybe if you went into some old archives or some of the old Charles Bukowski forums, you could find some interesting tidbits or information on the fact, did Charles Bukowski really evade the draft? But who knows? Now, in 1944, as Charles Bukowski was struggling, he was writing, and he sent in one of his short stories and was actually published in Story magazine. And that story was called The Aftermath of a Lengthy Rejection Slip. You can actually read the entirety of that in the Charles Bukowski compilation titled Portions of a Wine-Stained Notebook. I definitely recommend it. I'll show you guys some of the Bukowski books at the end of this documentary. Now, not long after 1946, Charles Bukowski was actually published again in a magazine called Portfolio Magazine, and the title of this story was called 20 Tanks from Castletown. And Charles Bukowski was starting to gain somewhat of an underground, I guess you could say, success. But some of these magazines obviously were not very underground. They were popular magazines at the time. They don't really exist in the capacity that they used to. But Story magazine was every writer's dream back then. And Charles Bukowski, though he was happy that he had a little bit of success, he didn't want to play by the literary society's rules. He didn't want to play by these stuffy agents' expectations of what his writing should have been. And he, as Charles Bukowski states, he kind of just ducked and hid from success and just started drinking for 10 years. That's a whole nother part of the Bukowski myth that raises some levels of controversy, but he sort of turned his back on early success, early fame, not only because he was a little bit disillusioned with sort of the having to kiss up to the literary agents and the publishers and all this kind of stuff, but also because as he states, he knew that he just hadn't lived enough. He needed to go out and have more relationships and drink more and fail more and have some success and just experience life as a whole in order to really fulfill his writing destiny. And you can that's definitely true of young writers. I didn't really start being able to write seriously till I was in my early 30s. I'm in my mid 30s now, I'm 35 now. So, the stuff I'm writing now is much better. I have enough material for a novel because I've lived 30 years and I've experienced things, both good and bad. But if you're trying to write a groundbreaking novel at the age of 19 or 20, I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'm saying you need some life experience. And Charles Bukowski has showed that to us, just like many other writers have showed us, all the way from Ernest Hemingway and Thomas Wolfe. It really takes a man's journey throughout his to get out of his adolescence and his early life to the time he's maybe 30 to really be able to have the material that he needs to write successfully. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, the early legacy of Charles Bukowski cannot be discussed without also discussing the mysterious Jane Cooney Baker, who among not only Bukowski fans but also Bukowski scholars is said to be Charles Bukowski's most serious muse, at least for the early part of his life. And they had a terribly dysfunctional relationship. She was not sort of the homebound wife loving figure that he was looking for, but they were both sitting at a bar one day and they just both started talking. They just kind of connected, probably over addiction and trauma. But he remained with Jane Cooney Baker for many years, for nearly 10 years on and off, because she ran around on him. She kind of carousing and cheating on him, and maybe he was doing the same, but he really desired to have a serious relationship with this woman. And apart from maybe a couple flings and a 300-pound prostitute, as he states in his early life, Jane Cooney Baker was really the woman that he fell head over heels in love with. And there's very little known actually about Jane Cooney Baker. Go on the Bukowski forums to look it up, but she was a severe alcoholic, and she ended up dying due to a burst stomach ulcer in the early 60s. But the relationship that he had, or that she had, with Charles Bukowski really informed his writing and informed sort of his worldview. And he sort of worshipped, Jane Cooney Baker on a certain level, even though she sort of broke his heart time and time again. Sort of these early days, or these mid years, of Charles Bukowski and his relationship with Jane Cooney Baker. More details and the fictional side of that can be found in Post Office, as well as Factotum, I believe. Betty is the stand-in for Jane Cooney Baker in Post Office, and in Factotum, I think the stand-in for Jane is actually Laura. And they do have sort of a hilariously funny relationship. They kind of troll each other. Charles Bukowski gets drunk and lies on the floor and says that, oh, I'm a genius, it's just nobody knows it yet. And she says, bullshit, get off the floor and go to work. And they just have this sort of playfully funny, but also very hostile, dysfunctional relationship. I think that's what's so interesting about artistic, creative people, is that some of their relationships are not only fascinating, but they're very dysfunctional. Look at Frida Kahlo and her husband, or look at Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, or Thomas Wolfe and Elaine Bernstein. Make sure you guys check out the Thomas Wolfe playlist down below on this channel, and maybe we'll start a Charles Bukowski playlist. It's been a while. I've been really wanting to get into some Charles Bukowski stuff. All across the board, we have in the literary writing world so many dysfunctional relationships, and Charles Bukowski and Jane Cooney Baker were one of them. In 1955, Charles Bukowski, as a result of his heavy drinking, actually suffered his own burst stomach ulcer and ended up in the charity ward in LA County. And they basically said that, if you take one more drink, you're dead. Of course, he listened to them for a short period of time. But as a result of his newfound sobriety at this time, he was still hanging out with Jane Cooney Baker. She kind of convinced him to, let's go to the track and start betting on horses. It'll keep your mind off drinking. He was like, this sounds really boring. But he actually becomes a huge fan of going to the track and watching the people and gambling and betting on horses. And he did this for a few months, maybe a few weeks, maybe a year, and then he claims that he just had one beer one day and he didn't die, so he kind of continued to drink, and he started mixing his wine with milk to kind of help coat his stomach, and he woke up the next day and he was fine. So we thought, hey, maybe I can start drinking a little bit again, and he continued to drink, till the day he died, rather, at the age of 71 or 72. But that's also another point of speculation, is the extent of Charles Bukowski's drinking. It's pretty evident, it's pretty clear that he was somewhat of an alcoholic. I tend to believe he was more of a binge drinker, because I have a hard time believing that if Charles Bukowski drank as much as he claims to have done in his writing, in his stories, in his poems, if the Charles Bukowski rather drank as much as the Henry Chinaski drank, I don't think he would have lived to be anywhere past age 50. And Charles Bukowski died in 1994 at the age of 71 or 72. So I tend to think he was more of a weekend drinker, a binge drinker. I don't think he was not like a Jack Kerouac alcoholic, drinking himself into a 52-year-old grave. I just don't think that's the case. Hell, Jack Kerouac was like 47 when he died from a burst stomach ulcer. But Charles Bukowski was maybe lucky. Maybe he'd really slowed down his drinking. Maybe it was just a biological blessing or a miracle that he didn't die much sooner. He did have some complications later in life with his drinking, obviously, and he had to cut down. But in terms of throughout his 30s, 40s, and 50s, and early 60s, he continued to drink rather heavily, but he was not really drinking the hard stuff anymore. He kind of switched over to beer and wine, which he always liked, but he sort of gave up the Cutty Shark and the heavy liquors and all that. But Henry Chinaski, drinking was part of the Bukowski myth. I don't think he drank as much as he claimed. Now, this short little brush from death, being rescued from death, rather, he basically just sat in the hospital and he was bleeding out of his rear end and coughing up blood. And he said that the blood is purple and it keeps coming, and you'd be surprised how much blood there is in a person. And Charles Bukowski, this short, little escaping death, he obviously easily could have died, but he begins to sort of have a newfound passion for life, and he begins his poetry career for the first time. And he sort of talks about how, all the energy, the life trauma that I had just sort of came out as poetry. The stories, the prose, the narratives had sort of gone somewhere, and he sort of switched to poetry. And the interesting, fascinating thing about Charles Bukowski's poetry is that it's very easy to read. It's pretty down to earth. Now, having said that, there is two genres of Charles Bukowski's poetry. His early poetry was more like, I don't know, Wordsworthian, or sort of I don't know, just it was more dense, it was thicker, there were longer paragraphs, some of them, not all of them, and he was sort of experimenting a lot, sort of idolizing some of the poets that he enjoyed or idolized himself. His later poetry became much more simplified. It was more like little short narratives, almost little short stories. It's almost like he took little tidbits out of his stories or his prose and sort of transformed that into poetry form. As Charles Bukowski states, poetry gave him an opportunity to sort of scream a little bit and sort of have this little self-indulgent conversation with not only himself, but also therapeutically communicate himself to the world about love and addiction and politics even, and just all the things that were sort of driving Bukowski crazy up here. He found the outlet of poetry to sort of give him a second life, both physically and intellectually. Now, that is another interesting point of controversy regarding Charles Bukowski's influences. Basically, any interview that you'll find or come across on Charles Bukowski being asked about his influences, he rarely has anything good to say about any other writers other than himself, but he does espouse Hemingway. He does like Dos Passos. He loves Dostoevsky. He tends to kind of shit on Henry Miller, and he doesn't even like Thomas Wolfe. He trolled Thomas Wolfe several times. Hates William Faulkner. Hates everybody. He does like Celine. Charles Bukowski was, I think, heavily influenced by his idols. He was a fanboy. He really liked John Fonte as well. He even got to meet John Fonte later on in life. But for the most part, he did not like the stuffy sort of highbrow literature that was being promoted at that time. And he didn't like he liked Henry Miller's straight stuff, as he says, but he did not like when Henry Miller started going up into the clouds and philosophizing about Aries and PCs and all this kind of stuff. And I can kind of see where he's coming from. Charles Bukowski, I think originally for me, was part of the attraction of Charles Bukowski is that it's not hard to read. And I think initially as a young man that can kind of lead you astray, because you find Bukowski and he's saying all the things that you're thinking and feeling, and he's writing about alcohol, writing about sex. It just kind of appeals to that young machismo sort of awakening. I'm not saying that's all that Bukowski is, because obviously he's much more. Bukowski has a lot of love poems. He has a lot of sort of interesting relationship poems and poems about nature, poems about cats, poems about alcohol, poem about heartbreak and ghosts and his traumas with his father. But sort of the overall way that the Charles Bukowski legend or ethos or mythos, I guess, sort of finds you, it tends to appeal to sort of that young machismo, frustrated male demographic perhaps, but I know a lot of women that actually enjoy Charles Bukowski as well. A lot of old people really like Charles Bukowski, but I think for the most part he kind of appeals to the younger generation. But having said that, his influences, to what extent did they actually influence his writing? I mean, you can obviously see the Hemingway influence, you can see the influence of Celine, you can see the influence of Dos Passos. So Charles Bukowski definitely trained and read some of the greatest writers that we've ever been blessed to have in the literary world. Now, sadly, in 1962, Jane Cooney Baker actually dies. It was not as lucky as Charles Bukowski was. She ended up with a burst stomach ulcer. And by this time, Charles Bukowski started to see Jane Cooney Baker in a more negative light. He realized that she was killing not only herself, but if he stayed with her, that she was going to kill him as well with her drinking or with her volatility. He sort of realized that although he loved her, he sort of realized that he needed to sort of get away from her, but they sort of remained in contact. I don't know the extent of what their relationship was by the time Jane Cooney Baker was in the hospital, but he goes to visit her on her deathbed, and he puts his hand, on her shoulder, on her hair or something, and she wakes up, almost on the brink of death and says, "I knew it would be you," and then she dies. It's just a very tragic situation, a very tragic tale of the relationship. I would like to see somebody write a novel or make a movie about the relationship. It was sort of like Barfly, but maybe a little bit more in depth about some of the mysteries behind the relationship of Charles Bukowski and Jane Cooney Baker. And I think a lot of fans and scholars are curious, and we don't have much information at all of Jane Cooney Baker other than what Charles Bukowski showed us in his poetry and in his novels. He's got some beautiful poems for Jane. There's one called Poem for Jane. There's another one called 10 Years Under Grass. I think there's a lot of really great poems that Charles Bukowski wrote for his love, his dedication to Jane Cooney Baker. And he claims that Jane Cooney Baker was starting to lose her physical charm, and the years of drinking had given her this huge beer belly, and she was wrinkled and grizzled and still smoking the cigarette and crossing her legs and talking all kinds of shit. But the initial attraction that Bukowski originally had found that made him fall in love with Jane Cooney Baker had started to erode because of her lifestyle and because of her lack of fidelity, her lack of dedication to him, to really starting a real life. And he sort of realized that he was drowning in her chaos, and that he was not going to succeed as a writer or as a man if he did not get away from her. So sadly, they broke up towards the end, but beautifully, Charles Bukowski, like I said, showed up at Jane Cooney Baker's deathbed and gave her some comfort in her final moments. Now, Charles Bukowski would be blessed from this time forward with many, many other women for a period of 10 or 15 years. In the period he wrote Women, obviously, and Post Office, while his literary career was really taking off, and he ended up getting married. But there is something special and, like I said, mysterious about his relationship with Jane Cooney Baker. And I think, I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but I'd like to think that there was no Jane Cooney Baker, there would not be a Charles Bukowski in the way that we know it. That's part of what attracts me to the Charles Bukowski universe, is that early relationship. He had a fascinatingly tumultuous relationship with Jane Cooney Baker, and what was it about her that he found so attractive or so beautiful? What was their connection? I mean, obviously it was physical, and they bonded over drinking and smoking, but there was obviously something else there. Jane Cooney Baker must have sort of nurtured the young Bukowski, the young man Bukowski, in some way that was maybe not 100% beneficial to him, but that got him by and gave him a little bit of creative juice to kind of keep going in those early years. Not long after Jane Cooney Baker's death, Charles Bukowski has another short-lived relationship with a woman named Frances Smith, who actually has his first and only child with, his daughter, and he actually ended up taking very good care of his daughter. The things did not work out with him and Frances Smith. She did not want to get married again, but as soon as he had found out that Frances Smith was pregnant with his daughter, Bukowski's daughter, he's like, let's get married. But she was like, no, I don't want to go through marriage again. So there were instances in Bukowski's life where he reached out to women and he wanted to sort of capture that family structure. But I think when push came to shove, despite Frances Smith sort of rejecting the marriage proposal, Charles Bukowski knew that he was going to be better off not being tied down in the traditional sense of marriage, because he still had a heavy alcohol problem, and he didn't really have that steady of a job. He was kind of working on and off the post office. Around this time, he began as a mail carrier, sort of Charles Bukowski's early life, but Charles Bukowski's daughter really has nothing but good things to say about Charles Bukowski. So that's another thing that sort of, we'll get to it later, but sort of overshadows the myth that Charles Bukowski was this huge misogynist, and all, which maybe he was to an extent, but he managed to still be somewhat of a father figure to his daughter. So there is that. Now, as we stated, after the death of Jane Cooney Baker and after his marriage failed with Frances Smith and sort of his short brush with death, escaping death after being in the charity ward in Los Angeles with a burst stomach ulcer, he has a new lease on life, and his writing career really takes off at this time. It doesn't succeed 100% right away until we get to sort of like the late 60s, early 70s, but he starts to write on a regular basis. And by 1968, Charles Bukowski was published in underground local literary publications such as Open City as well as LA Free Press. And despite Bukowski's disparagement of the rising 60s counterculture, this is important too, Bukowski's work was celebrated and published in many prior to the burgeoning anti-war hippie movement. And we'll get to that later, but I think it's interesting that Charles Bukowski was sort of propped up and sort of promoted by the early version of the counterculture, or was he potentially at some point along the line, I'm not saying the entire career of Charles Bukowski was sort of compromised or influenced by some type of social engineering, but perhaps the later career of Charles Bukowski, some of the important figures of the counterculture thought that they could influence or use Bukowski's work and sort of myth to sort of influence the larger scene of the counterculture, the anti-war movement, free love, sexual revolution, all this kind of stuff kind of makes you start wondering, especially when we get to Charles Bukowski's sort of Hollywood career when he was, writing a screenplay for Barbette Schroeder and was hanging out with Sean Penn and Madonna. And we'll get to all that later. But he started to become successful and really came into his own with writing. And he developed a column called The Notes of a Dirty Old Man. I actually have the copy of the book. You can still read it. His collaboration with this guy in New Orleans in the late 60s that he published some poetry books with as well. And so despite Charles Bukowski being sort of this allegedly dysfunctional, drunk, and misanthropic guy that could not really network, he actually networked fairly well and was starting to make things happen for himself during the late 60s to early 70s. Now, around this time in 1968, due to Charles Bukowski's controversial writing and some of his affiliations, literary-wise and just sort of socially, the FBI actually started keeping a file on the middle-aged Charles Bukowski, which is also interesting. It just sort of makes you wonder, why was the FBI watching Bukowski? Was it just because of his writing was radical and he was an upcoming figure, or was it because he evaded the draft? Maybe that had something to do with it. I think the question could be asked, was Bukowski involved or a target of some type of intelligence agency that used him or his legacy, his work, his attitude to sort of promote their ideals? Was Bukowski some type of an undercover agent or sort of intelligence, counterintelligence, socio-political asset to sort of these larger political social movements that were taking place? And maybe, like we said a couple minutes ago, Charles Bukowski's work could sort of be used to influence the counterculture. Maybe he wasn't a full-blown hippie, maybe he wasn't a full-blown beatnik, but he sort of fell into that countercultural community, if you will. Now, sort of during the early 70s, we sort of get to sort of the latter period, or not the latter period, but the sort of the midway point in Charles Bukowski's life as well as success. And he starts to get documentaries, made about him by Taylor Hackford. That's a really great one in black and white. You can still watch it on YouTube. After his collaboration with Taylor Hackford, sort of met Barbette Schroeder, and Barbette Schroeder made probably thousands of hours worth of footage that you can now watch on the Charles Bukowski tapes. And then later he collaborated with Barbette Schroeder on the sort of vision and the screenplay for the film Barfly with Mickey Rourke and that other lady. Pretty successful film. And you could see how Charles Bukowski really had sort of by that time made the big time. Now there's a lot of different eras of Bukowski, if you will. We have the early poetry era of the 60s and the 70s, and then we have sort of the Notes of the Dirty Old Man era, and then we have sort of the Taylor Hackford era before he really took off, but he was kind of on the cusp of that. This is roughly around the time also early 1970s where we sort of go into this other category of Charles Bukowski, and there's a lot to cover in this second section. Publishing novels for the first time, his relationship with the publisher John Martin and the Black Sparrow Press, as well as his tumultuous relationship with Linda King. In the early 70s, Bukowski was slowly building a reputation as a writer from his dogged pursuit of writing in underground writing magazines and a collaboration with John Martin, who signed him onto Black Sparrow Press, publishing his first novel in 1971 called Post Office. This period in Bukowski's life also marks his relationship with Linda King, whom he dated on and off for several years. Linda King, known as Lydia Vance in his novels, was another extremely dysfunctional romance for Bukowski, yet Linda King was much more compatible on sort of a creative level, if you will, than his relationship with Jane Cooney Baker or even some of the other women. Also importantly, Linda King was not an addict. She was actually a sculptor. She was successful. She was independent. She had previous relationships. She wasn't dependent on alcohol. So his relationship with Linda King, though it was tumultuous, sort of a codependent, they did have sort of a beautiful relationship, and the fact that they were both artists. And I think Linda King started reading some of his poetry or one of his early novels, or maybe saw him, in the Notes of a Dirty Old Man, and she reached out to him and started to sculpt this beautiful bust of his face, and that's where their early relationship sort of begins. And you can read about that in Charles Bukowski's novel Women, and they sort of start to have this really beautiful relationship. It's complicated. She notices that he has a drinking problem, and you'll also, if you watch the Taylor Hackford documentary, he actually has another girlfriend at the same time called Liza, and she's another interesting figure. I think she was prestigious than even Linda King was, and she kind of brought him some connections in the writing entertainment industry, but he was sort of had this unsatiable lust for Linda King and was unable to remain sort of faithful to Liza. And that's something we sort of forgot to cover, was his relationship with Liza. And every time that Charles Bukowski and Linda King would get into a fight or a scuffle, she would throw his typewriter out the window, and then he would come back to her house and give her back the sculpted head of himself. And it's actually a beautiful sculpture. But eventually push came to shove. They started calling the cops on each other. Charles Bukowski even busted Linda King's nose one time, and she was bleeding all over the place. And then he gave a poetry reading out in San Francisco, I believe, with Lawrence Ferlinghetti. These books were being published at the City Lights bookstore, who was, owned and promoted by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And that's another thing that sort of starts to get the gears turning in my head. Lawrence Ferlinghetti obviously needs no introduction. He was a huge influence in promoting the Beat Generation. So Charles Bukowski was obviously, he just didn't make it alone. He was obviously being promoted and circulated by highly influential people in the literary community. So I don't want people to get it twisted. Like, Bukowski was not like this Franz Kafka guy that just sat in his closet writing and didn't want anybody to read his stuff. No, like, he got out there, he got published, he was writing every day, he did whatever he had to do to get published. So this idea that we have sort of nowadays that you can just sit around and get discovered. I mean, Right Conscious, that YouTube channel has talked about this sort of idea as well. And that ideology kind of hurts writers. This sort of tortured, misunderstood genius, idea of genius, that you can just sort of do nothing and get discovered just because you're good. And that these famous writers, any of these figures, that this idea that they, just came out of nowhere is kind of a false idea. It's a false paradigm. If you want to be a successful writer, you have to get published, you have to work, you have to write, and you can't just be like a bum. Yeah, maybe you're going to have obviously there's always exceptions, and Bukowski in a lot of ways was an exception. But going back to sort of his relationship with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and his relationship, this guy from Germany named Karl Weisner, actually roughly around this time, also discovers Bukowski and is willing to work with Bukowski to translate all of Bukowski's work over in Germany and some other languages too. And Charles Bukowski was picked up over in Europe and became arguably more popular as a European writer than he actually was at the time in America. Nowadays, Bukowski is known as sort of an quintessential American writer, but he has a huge following, and he did during this time in Germany because of figures like Karl Weisner. How did Karl Weisner discover him? There's a little bit of debate on how that actually worked, but Charles Bukowski was cooperating and working, doggedly with many different individuals to sort of promote this, Bukowski, agenda that was taking place. Now, also also shown in the documentary of the Taylor Hackford piece called Bukowski, is this time when Charles Bukowski started to offer poetry readings. And then you see the footage of him at City Lights. And going back to Linda King, he had this huge fight after the City Lights poetry reading. Everybody was drunk, and Charles Bukowski was drunk and continued to drink throughout the night, and got into a couple fist fights with people, and Linda King, broke down the door and scratched his face again. I mean, how many times Charles Bukowski's been scratched in the face? And they break up for that time, but eventually this tumultuous relationship with Linda King, I think Bukowski knew that it had reached its course. Maybe Linda King broke up with him. I think it's somewhat documented in Women, but his relationship obviously ends with Linda King somewhere around this time. But he wrote some beautiful poems about Linda King. She's, serves a purpose in his novel as a female protagonist slash antagonist. And I think we mentioned sort of the accusations of misogyny that we will get into later. But sort of, a couple minutes ago, we sort of said that the early 70s to mid 80s was sort of one of the most interesting and successful periods of Bukowski's life. And sort of after all the 70s chaos of after his novel Women was written, after he had gotten all this sex and debauchery out of his system, he actually meets this other woman called Linda Lee Biegel, who owns a sort of a health food store, and she had come to one of his poetry readings and I think gave him her number or something. So ladies out there, you don't always have to wait for the man to make the first move. God damn it. If you like a guy, reach out to him, give him your number, hit him up in the DMs, whatever it is you got to do to get his attention, especially if he's a successful man, because he might not notice you out of all the myriad of other ladies that are trying to get his attention. So Bukowski develops this beautiful relationship with Linda Lee Biegel, and she sort of starts to nurture him and get him to cut down on his drinking even, which was a seemingly impossible task. But Bukowski was doing fairly well. He was more successful than ever. He had published Women, he had published Factotum, and after a few more years of living in LA, he actually moves with his new wife, Linda. I think they weren't married at this time. They get married later on in the 80s. But by the end of the 70s, early 80s, Charles Bukowski is relocated to San Pedro, California, where he can have more time to focus and write, and he sort of leaves the early life of his ne'er-do-well lifestyle behind. He had that place in downtown LA, which you can learn more about on from the Taylor Hackford documentary. When he was working at the post office, he lived with a bunch of degenerates and drug addicts. So the latter section of this sort of documentary video is going to be structured around the different styles of his writing. We've talked about some of them already. He had short stories, novels, poetry, and some essays. He had articles in magazines. The legacy of his misogyny or alleged misogyny, and just the controversy and myth and questions that I have about the Bukowski legacy as a whole. So let's break this down. We did talk about Charles Bukowski's short stories that took place in the 40s, 50s, and 60s prior to when he was writing any novels or any poetry whatsoever. The early part of Charles Bukowski's legacy, to my knowledge, from what I've read, was all short stories. And by the time we get to his poetry, like we discussed, he almost had two different styles. His earlier style was a complex and dense style imitating classic poets, or in sort of a more romantic lyrical style, versus his later repertoire, which is much more sparse, direct, and less symbolically allegorical or complex. And I think that is more like the Bukowski that we've come to know as a poet, like his drinking poems and his womanizing poems. And like I said, that's not the only thing that you can get out of Bukowski, but in the literary community, such a polarizing figure because he's either extremely overrated or he's underrated. I would say maybe he's somewhere in the middle. I mean, I don't think Bukowski is really like, you don't read him in school. You don't really hear that much about him anywhere. You don't really see his books that much, at the used bookstore like you used to. So he's kind of goes through periods where he's highly praised and maybe overrated. Maybe he's overrated by sort of a certain sector of the literature community. But I think every writer, to a certain extent, is kind of overrated. And so let's get into sort of the stuff that I'm saving the best for last. And some of the questions I want to ask are not to discourage or impugn Charles Bukowski's legacy. He's a good writer. I enjoy reading him. Here are some questions that I will leave this video with. Was the real Bukowski the same as Henry Chinaski? And I think we've been kind of asking ourselves that this entire time. If he was this sort of drunken, carousing, degenerate, sex addict, alcoholic poet, how did he manage to have so many semi-successful relationships? How did he manage to get married? And how did he manage to get published? And he must have had some part of him that was able to coincide or sort of to work with people. He wasn't a complete nihilist. But I do find the early legacy of Bukowski a little bit questioning. Where did he get all of his money to travel from? I find it hard to believe that he was just sleeping on park benches and going to the the library and getting drunk every night and getting kicked out and then taking a bus to Philadelphia and then New Orleans and living in a shack. There's a lot of holes in Bukowski's story, and maybe that is purposeful, just sort of to feed that sort of mythical mythos of Bukowski, if you will. Did he actually jump from job to job, travel the country, become homeless, etc.? So maybe his father gave him a certain amount of allowance or stipend, or maybe somebody in the family. He was close with his grandparents in Germany. Maybe they were giving him money somewhere along the line. And I'm talking about towards the later part of his writing career. How did he get in touch with people like Taylor Hackford? How did he get, later on, he became friends with Sean Penn, and I don't think he was very impressed with Hollywood culture. I'm not saying that Bukowski sought out Hollywood or elite culture. No, it was actually the reverse. These people saw that Bukowski had something to say. He was this really interesting, down-to-earth American sort of poet, this American novelist, and these sort of stuffy people that were not necessarily worthy of him, perhaps, sort of came flocking to him. The Hollywood elite, the directors and the film people, the newspaper, they all came knocking on Bukowski's door because Bukowski had made such a big impact in the underground and in the mainstream at this time. But he did not do it alone. He obviously had connections. Maybe he knew some people. Maybe somebody was funding him. Maybe somebody in the burgeoning counterculture, the 60s culture, or the quote-unquote sexual revolution, the degenerate culture, sort of used Bukowski, like we stated earlier, to not only help him spread his degenerate idea of what literature was supposed to be, but also to sort of prop up their own, counterculture degenerate ideas. So these are questions that I think are definitely worth asking. Did he really end up in the charity ward with a bleeding stomach ulcer? How did he manage to drink as much as he did? Did he even drink at all? Did he do drugs? Did he really, have this abusive relationship with his father, or was that just part of sort of the legend? Charles Bukowski was also known and got away with espousing people like Adolf Hitler, and he talked about how he admired serial murderers, and there's some very shocking, sort of alarming things that Bukowski discusses. And maybe what was he doing? He's even was accused of rape a couple of times. So was Bukowski, did he actually ever physically harm people? Yes, he did. These are things that have crossed my mind because of not only Bukowski's writing, but the people that he was connected with, and just so many of the unanswered questions that exist within the Bukowski universe. So lastly, we sort of get to his writing style. Was he a good writer? That's arguable for some people. I think you can't ignore whether or not you like his writing. I think you can't ignore the fact that he was an impactful writer. He was a direct writer, and Bukowski can say something in one or two sentences that it would take another great writer 2 pages to write. So there's a certain immediacy and way that you relate to Charles Bukowski that I think is profound, that is similar to Hemingway. And despite his critics that say he's limited, he only writes about this, he only writes about that, he's not good at, he actually is a beautiful writer. There's so much beautiful simplicity to his writing. There's that one poem where the landlady is screaming at him for the rent with her sweaty, flappy arms, and he's talking about how depressed he is and how he's got all these empty bottles staring him back in the face. But the sun was still good, though. The sun coming through the window, he writes, was still good. And there's just, every once in a while, there's this delicious little juice, as Charles Bukowski would say, that makes you say, hey, yes, this is why we read Bukowski. Is all of his work good? No. But as a whole, his novels are good. They have a flow to them. They're catchy. They do have some boring parts, but for the most part, he keeps you reading. And his poetry is really great fun just to read in the bathtub, or read before you go to bed, or read just to get your ideas flowing. Practice writing like Bukowski. Even if you don't want to be like Bukowski, it's good to know how to write like that, because that's why he is so successful among his fan base. He speaks to people, whether or not he was a good person, whether or not he was a misogynist. I think he had obviously some misogynistic tendencies, but he actually writes beautifully about women. He has a beautiful poem called The Shower, where he takes a shower with Linda King, I think, and they wash each other's body, and he's just enjoying the simple moments being with the woman that he loves. And he writes beautifully about all the women to a point. Obviously there was an aspect to Bukowski that you could just not get to. Even Linda King, or I think even Liza in the Charles Bukowski Taylor Hackford film, talked about how Bukowski is not anything like he is in his writing, really. He's not anything like he is in his poetry. He's more of this hostile, it's often misogynistic, antagonistic type of person, but that's why the legacy of Charles Bukowski is so interesting, because he can write a beautiful love poem about Linda King or Linda Beigel or Jane Cooney Baker, but then he can turn around, and so he's a polarizing, very conflicted, complex figure, and that's what makes Bukowski interesting. Getting further on to Bukowski's connections and relationships in the entertainment media industry, we mentioned Sean Penn, Madonna, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Carl Weissener, who acted as Bukowski's German agent. So Bukowski, for sort of the relatively short life that he had and the relatively short literary career that he had during that time, I mean, Bukowski didn't really become successful by today's standards until he was like age 50. He was working a full-time job at the post office, and John Martin kind of discovered him. Carl Weissener kind of discovered him. And Charles Bukowski said there is no more hidden talent laying under the bushes waiting to be discovered. Communication has killed talent. The internet has killed talent. Newspapers and media and fake news and narcissism and filters and Instagram and yada, yada, yada. And all this crap that we see on the internet now has killed talent. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm still a talented writer. My novel's still going to get published, and I hope you all will write novels too, and poetry, and maybe you'll make some videos about Charles Bukowski or some of your favorite writers too, so that we can hear from you. Please leave your thoughts in the comments down below about Charles Bukowski, his work, his legacy, any cool documentaries about Bukowski, let me know what your favorite Bukowski work is. Let me know if there's any other I should get back in my collection. And yeah, that's the Charles Bukowski video. I really appreciate y'all sticking around. Make sure you guys check out the other videos on this playlist. We will see everybody next time.